Hello and welcome. As humans, we often like to believe that we have good reasons for the things we do, that our behaviors are more than just conditioned reactions to stimuli. We want our actions to contribute towards attaining our consciously considered desires. In reality, people's actions aren't always consistent with their most deeply held beliefs about how they'd like to be or how they ought to act. We succumb to habits, we act impulsively, and sometimes we end up undermining our own self-defined interests. A popular explanation for this kind of self-sabotage is that it results from internal conflict between rationality and emotion. Our rational minds work to keep our behaviors in line with our goals, while our emotions tempt us to do whatever feels best in the moment, regardless of the consequences. While this model may contain a grain of truth, I think it does us a lot of harm by painting emotions as irrational and inconvenient. Emotion is an ineradicable part of the human condition, and an essential component in human motivation. Emotions are not intrinsically good or bad. What matters is how we respond to them. In this video, I'll be talking about emotional expression on the internet and how I think we as a society could do a better job of preparing people to respond skillfully to internet emotions. I've played a lot of online multiplayer video games in my life, including such games as League of Legends and Dota 2. For those who aren't aware, these games are notorious for having particularly high rates of online expressions of anger. I think that video game rage is a good topic to start with because it's relatively simple compared to everything else I want to discuss. Except at the highest echelons of competitive play, there isn't anything materially at stake in an online match. Video game rage rarely serves any identifiable external purpose, and for the most part, people don't enjoy it. This is a very clear case where people respond to emotions in a way that undermines their conscious intentions. After all, people tend to play video games for enjoyment, relaxation, a sense of control or escape, not to get into a shouting match with complete strangers over voice chat. So why do people do it? Well, one obvious explanation is that some players become so emotionally invested in their in-game performance and status that any challenge to their skill or rank can lead to intense feelings of anger and agitation. Anyone who's played competitive games of any sort knows that losing a game you're invested in can induce unpleasant emotions. Those emotions can drive players to analyze their mistakes and improve, which is a huge source of enjoyment in competitive games. The goal isn't necessarily to get rid of the feelings of anger, it's to manage them and express them in a more productive way. But in order to manage our emotions, it is first necessary to be aware of them. Mindfulness of emotion is a tremendously valuable psychological trait to develop. If you aren't consciously aware of an emotion, then you won't be able to respond to it until it grows so intense that it demands your attention. This skill is particularly important to learn for those of us who habitually repress emotion. Emotional suppression can be an important coping mechanism for people in situations where they can't safely process or express their feelings. Some people suppress emotions simply because they were socialized to do so. In any case, emotional repression can have significant negative consequences for a person's mental health in the long term. I've been attempting to become more mindful of my emotions for years, and while it isn't an easy thing to do, I think I'm a lot better at it than I used to be. I used to feel like there was something deeply wrong with me that stopped me from experiencing emotions other than anger as clearly as I should. I was able to cry and enjoy emotions like love and compassion as a child, but I feared that I had somehow lost these abilities in the process of growing up. Of course, I wasn't fundamentally broken, I just needed to relearn how to pay attention to my emotional state. For me, this meant going to therapy, cultivating stronger social support, and actively practicing getting in touch with my emotions. I would lay comfortably in bed, think about topics and memories that I thought might evoke an emotional response, and then wait with the intention of trying to feel and accept any sensations that might arise, no matter how unpleasant. At first, I didn't feel anything, and the whole process felt like a waste of time. But with practice and patience, I started feeling like I was sorting through all the feelings I had previously set aside. I went from never crying to crying intensely multiple times every week. I started making detailed daily journal entries about my feelings, used a mood tracking app, and practiced talking about my feelings to people I trusted. This was an exhausting process at times, but I now feel much better off for having done it. I hope that everyone who suffers from emotional numbness and repression gets a chance to get back in touch with their emotions. And emotional mindfulness practices aren't just for people with repressed emotions. I believe everyone can benefit from learning to pay close attention to their emotional state. One highly effective way of managing emotions is to be aware of when one is in an emotionally vulnerable state and acting accordingly. Returning to the example of online games, every time I sit down to play a competitive video game, I take a second to check in with myself and make sure that I'll still feel alright no matter how the match goes. If I notice between games that I'm starting to get upset, I'll stop playing competitively. If the game has an optional chat feature and I don't feel like listening to people who might be upset with how I'm playing, I'll turn it off. This is simple stuff, but I think it can make a big difference for people with strong emotional investments in the games that they play. In addition, this idea of emotional awareness and managing exposure to emotionally charged scenarios is equally applicable in other situations I'll be discussing. Let's move on to a more complicated issue: online social and political hatred. There's no shortage of expressions of hatred on the internet, and if you use any social media platform for long enough, you're sure to encounter some eventually. First and foremost, I think it's important to reiterate that anger is not intrinsically good or bad. Even if someone experiences anger because they hold a belief that I strongly disagree with, I still wouldn't say that their anger is wrong. I'm only interested in making value judgments about the way that anger is expressed. In the same vein, I'm not in the business of telling people that their emotional responses to online hatred are wrong. My goal is to examine how these emotions can be managed without causing unnecessary suffering. There are two distinct perspectives that I want to explore: that of the person expressing their anger and that of the people reading or engaging with it. Personally, I don't think I've ever expressed much anger through the internet because I tend not to post very much in general. Aside from these videos, I almost never write on forums or social media, and when I do, it's usually about things that I'm interested in rather than things that make me upset. However, I do sometimes find myself experiencing emotions in response to things I read online, which is what I'll focus on first. I can think of 4 general factors that influence whether or not I'll have an emotional response to online content. First, context. How am I feeling and what am I doing before accessing the content? Next, significance. How deeply do I care about the topics being discussed and how sensitive am I to their discussion? 3. Tone. Does the content come across as condescending, accusatory, etc.? And lastly, directedness. To what extent is the content about or directed towards me or a group I care about? My hope is that this framework is broad enough to have some explanatory power when applied to a wide variety of unpleasant emotional responses to online content across the social and political spectrum. For me personally, context is the most important factor in determining whether or not I'll be upset by something online. If I'm not already in a depressed or anxious state, it's unlikely that I'll be negatively affected by anything I read. When I'm in a positive state of mind, I tend to view social media less in the first place, and even if I do stumble across content that I find objectionable, I'll probably just ignore it or skim it out of morbid curiosity. On the other hand, if I'm already feeling shameful, worthless, or empty, I'll tend to seek out content that I know will prod at my insecurities and reinforce my most uncharitable assessments of myself. I think a lot of people engage in this sort of emotional masochism, and it's clearly not a healthy thing to do. But when I'm in a state where I feel like I deserve to suffer, it's hard to act in my own best interests. Generating enough self-compassion to convince myself that I deserve to feel better is often half the battle. Ever since I noticed this pattern of behavior in myself, I've been better about interrupting it. Emotional awareness is important here too. It's important for me to be able to learn about perspectives I disagree with, but I also need to recognize when that desire to learn gets hijacked by my conditioned impulse to drag myself down. We don't always have perfect control over what we see online, but we can at least do our best to manage what we see and when in order to avoid causing ourselves unnecessary pain. The roles of the other 3 factors are fairly clear. If you care a lot about a topic, you're probably more likely to be emotionally affected by content about it online. The tone of a message powerfully influences how people respond to it. We all know what it feels like to engage with someone who comes across as condescending or abrasive. And it's only natural that we tend to be more emotionally invested in discussions that directly address us or those that we care about. I think that these latter factors are comparatively difficult to control. It's neither possible nor desirable to just stop caring about social and political issues, and we have no way of controlling other people's tone or stopping them from addressing us. So then the solution must be to manage how we respond to the emotions we feel. That task will be my focus for the remainder of the video. Because this is a deeply personal topic, I want to make it clear that I'm not pretending to have all the answers. All I can really do is share what seems to work well for me. The primary emotions that I have trouble with online are anger, usually in response to messages I perceive as ignorant or harmful, and shame, usually in response to content that I feel undermines my sense of goodness and self-worth. These are two very different emotional responses, and so I'll address them separately. Anger can be an incredibly strong source of motivation. When I get angry about an issue, it can drive me to express my beliefs as clearly as I can. I want to get people to see things from my perspective, and so I'll think a lot about what arguments I think will work the best. We're often socialized to view anger as a negative or dangerous emotion, but when you're angry, it can feel amazing to speak your mind and be heard. That process of expression doesn't need to hurt anyone. There's a reason people flock to speakers who can express their anger while remaining articulate. Anger, when well harnessed, comes across as passion, and it can be absolutely infectious. Unfortunately, not everyone feels like they have an effective avenue to being heard. If you're upset by a YouTube video, then the comment section will often not be the most conducive environment to talking honestly about your feelings. At the same time, many people don't feel comfortable talking to anyone they know in real life about something that made them angry on the internet. A therapist can often be an excellent person to talk things through with, and in any case, there are plenty of communities online that create safe environments for people to vent their anger. However, sometimes it isn't enough just to be heard by someone. Sometimes you really want to be heard by the person or group that upset you in the first place. If the person you want to address isn't available, you might start looking for others to stand in for them. The target of your anger broadens from the individual who upset you to some group to which they belong. For example, if you're angry about someone doing action X, then it seems natural to expand your target of anger to anyone who does X. This process is usually happening subconsciously, and it often doesn't stop there. You might feel angry at people with traits that seem to correlate with action X, regardless of whether or not they've actually done X. You might study the chain of causality underlying action X and expand your anger to the people, systems, and beliefs that contribute to it. With enough people on board, this kind of anger has the potential to affect real change. However, it can also cause a lot of pointless suffering. There is a fine line between being pointed and being unnecessarily hurtful, but we've all seen examples of people taking their online expressions of anger way too far. Personally, I never want to post something with the sole intention of doing another person or group harm, regardless of what I might think of their beliefs or actions. I find that speaking out of a desire to hurt rarely makes me feel better in the long run. Usually I end up feeling worse. Like any emotion, hatred serves a purpose. It tells us when we've been threatened or harmed, and empowers us to do what's necessary in order to protect ourselves. But once hatred is no longer needed, it can become painful to hold on to. Some parts of the internet seem perfectly designed for intensifying and perpetuating anger. You start with an issue that people care about very strongly. Opposing sides form their own online communities and become increasingly polarized. Soon, people on the other side are no longer fellow humans who happen to say or believe the wrong things. They're the enemy and they need to be attacked. It's easy to lose sight of the humans behind the words and to perceive each member of the opposing camp as a mere embodiment of their beliefs rather than the unique person that they are. This is something I struggle with sometimes, although not with regard to any of the topics I've covered so far on this channel. The two issues that seem to cause me the most anger are environmentalism and animal rights. I bring this up because arguments against online tribalism like the one I'm making here can often give the impression that every issue has a reasonable center and that the extremes are always equally wrong. This is not what I'm saying. When it comes to animal rights, for example, many would likely find my positions extreme and polarizing. I believe that any being capable of suffering has moral value and should be treated with compassion. Because of the choices we make as a species, billions of sentient creatures are subjected to horrific, needless suffering and death every year. When I become too fixated on that reality, I sometimes feel so much anger that I don't know what to do with it. Even so, I never want that anger to get channeled into making someone feel worse just for the sake of punishing them. I don't think there's any contradiction in taking a strong or even extreme position on an issue while simultaneously warning against the potentially harmful effects of polarization. One technique I think can be helpful is to challenge and deconstruct the idea that people have free will. It's easier to let go of hatred for a person if you can conceptualize them as a product of circumstances outside their ultimate control. After all, we live in a universe governed by physics, not human will. What we think of as a free choice is really just a sort of complex computational process occurring in the brain. It can also help to be reminded that people are often acting out of ignorance, suffering, insecurity, fear, and other undesirable mental states. Someone who comes across online as hateful and condescending might be motivated by painful emotions, and I think it's worth trying to have empathy for others whenever possible. One of my favorite types of meditation is metta, or loving kindness, and a key part of the practice is to extend compassion even to one's enemies. Compassion feels good, and it often arises from a place of inner strength and stability. Even from a purely pragmatic perspective, compassion can have a strong effect on people, especially in a context where they expect hatred or derision. A lot of people go into discussions about veganism, animal rights, or environmentalism expecting to feel judged, and the activists that I admire the most tend to subvert that expectation rather than reinforcing it. Now I want to move on to feelings of shame and worthlessness. I've already touched on the importance of emotional awareness and managing access to potentially hurtful content, so now I want to focus on the things I do to respond to those feelings when they arise. As I mentioned before, I'm particularly sensitive to content that challenges my belief that I'm a decent person or that I'm worthy of basic respect and care. It's all too easy to find online content telling people that they're evil, worthless, disgusting, irredeemable, and so on. For people without a resilient sense of identity and self-esteem, those sorts of messages can cause a lot of distress. When I'm feeling depressed, it isn't a matter of just being extremely sad. It feels like crucial aspects of my sense of self are missing or malfunctioning. I'll feel disconnected not only from my emotions, but from the people, projects, and convictions that would ordinarily make my life feel meaningful. It's in that anhedonic void that I'll be most likely to look for someone on the internet to tell me how I ought to feel about myself. One of my main strategies in addressing this issue is to construct and practice holding on to a more stable sense of self. I mentioned earlier that I believe all sentient beings have moral value and are worthy of basic respect. One of the reasons I choose to take this as a fundamental moral belief is that it could never give me a rational justification for excluding myself from moral consideration. No matter what I might feel shameful about, I can't deny that I'm a sentient being. That can give me enough of a foothold to convince myself that I don't deserve to feel depressed, and that therefore it's not wrong for me to try to feel better. Sometimes, even this very basic form of self-compassion will allow me to experience and process sadness again. If I can manage to cry for a while, then I'll usually feel a bit better. Building on that foundation of self-compassion, I'll remind myself that there's nothing so fundamentally wrong with me that I'm incapable of being loved or cared about. Depression can convince you that nobody really cares, but it isn't true. There are always people out there who care about you and want you to be happy. In this video, I've focused mostly on the more thorny parts of the internet, but there are also communities of support dedicated to helping those struggling with mental illness understand that they aren't alone and that they deserve to feel better. Lastly, while I'm not a religious person, I often feel the need to incorporate some sense of spirituality into my identity. My version of spirituality isn't really a specific set of beliefs, but rather an orientation towards experience. My goal is to cultivate mindfulness, equanimity, and compassion in my daily experience of the world. When an emotion like anger, shame, or sadness arises, I want to be able to merely observe it, accept it, and allow it to pass. With this kind of perspective, painful and challenging experiences can be recontextualized as opportunities for practice. On the other hand, I want to be able to notice and deeply appreciate when I'm experiencing something pleasant. I'm sure to talk about my positions on spirituality in future videos, so I'll leave it at this for now. In closing, I want to briefly acknowledge that for some people there's a lot of stigma attached to talking openly about emotions and discussing how to respond to them in a productive way. One of the overarching themes I hope to develop with this channel is that there's nothing wrong or childish with having and talking about emotions, and that even if you've been socialized to ignore or repress them, it's still possible to unravel that conditioning and learn to express yourself freely. Thanks for watching.